In 1206, a fractured clan of desert nomads was united under a name that would soon make kingdoms tremble. Within a century, their descendants would cross frozen rivers, stone walls, and treacherous oceans, not for plunder, but for total domination. The horizon of the 13th century is painted in brutal contrasts. While Europe is governed by a web of feudal castles, codes of honor, and conventional warfare, in the heart of the Eurasian steppe, a force emerges that defies the logic of permanence. The Mongols don't build walls, they breach the walls of others. They don't cling to territories, they shape them as extensions of their tactics. They don't follow the rules of war, they reinvent them. In the vacuum between the static world and the mobile horde, two utterly distinct and equally brilliant figures arise. Genghis Khan, the unifier, the architect of asymmetric warfare, whose mind operated like a multi-layered chessboard, and Kublai Khan, the statesman, the emperor who understood that victory wasn't just reaching China's walls, but turning them into part of the Mongol power machine. Victor Davis Hanson, comparing Western military tradition to Mongol conflicts, argues that the war of attrition and position, typical of sedentary empires, was vulnerable to total mobility, a strategy where space is fluid, time is a weapon, and the enemy never knows where the next blow will come from. For Hanson, genius lies less in winning battles and more in reshaping the battlefield itself. This documentary doesn't glorify barbarity. It unravels how two men, across different generations, turned the chaos of the steppe into an adaptive, swift, and relentless command structure. The genius of Genghis and Kublai Khan lies not in brutality, but in clarity of vision, understanding that the battlefield begins long before the first strike and ends long after the last corpse. Like a living organism, the Mongol army reacted, divided, encircled, vanished, and returned. Under Genghis, war was like breathing, rapid, rhythmic, lethal. Under Kublai, it became a state, shaped by bureaucracy, writing, diplomacy, yet never losing its nomadic soul. While the world saw them as barbarians, they read maps, calculated reigns, studied cultures, and planned their next move. This video is a study of military genius in its purest form, a journey into the minds of the Khans. But it comes with a provocative thesis. What makes a commander unforgettable isn't the glory of a brilliant victory, it's the ability to operate in friction, in chaos, and still turn it into domination. Why did no empire survive the clash with Mongol logic? What was it about this mobile doctrine that dissolved centuries-old structures like dust in the steppe? Prepare to enter a world where battles are silent before they are loud, where tactics begin not with formation, but with intent, and where victory is measured not in territory, but in adaptation. At the heart of this nomadic colossus are two minds, a warrior who believed in mobility as order, and an emperor who saw governance as the continuation of war. Together, they didn't just conquer, they imposed a new logic on the known world. You're about to relive that logic. Decide, do you lead like a king or like a Khan? When Mongol armies appeared on the horizon, chroniclers, Arab, Persian, or Chinese, often described scenes blending awe and disdain. Sun-scorched men on small, swift horses, clad in rough furs and makeshift armor, dust-covered, with arrows dangling from saddles and faces locked in stoic silence. To a general in Damascus or a Song court official, they didn't look like an army, they looked like armed shepherds. But what they couldn't see, what no map or report could reveal, was what pulsed beneath that rugged image, an invisible, cold, ruthless, and astonishingly precise machine. Genghis hadn't just built a fighting force, he had turned every warrior into a conscious node in a collective military mind. The structure Genghis created wasn't visible in parades or ceremonies. It existed in a moral code, a command logic, and an invisible architecture of a self-managing war machine.
While European kings relied on castles and blood oaths, and Chinese emperors issued orders through silk scrolls and bureaucratic mazes, Genghis bet on something simpler, more brutal, and more effective. He created a system where every soldier knew exactly who to obey and, more importantly, why. The Mongol army was organized in simple but powerful layers. 10 men formed an Arban, 100 a Zun, 1,000 a Minghan, and 10,000 a Tumen. These numbers alone don't capture the soul of the structure. What made it lethal was the human bond it forged. Each Arban was more than a combat unit, it was a battlefield family. Each commander wasn't just a superior, he was someone who rode alongside, sharing the cold, the dried meat, and the fear. This disciplined decentralization created something adversaries couldn't grasp, an army that could split into dozens of columns and strike simultaneously without losing cohesion. Instead of waiting for distant orders, group leaders made decisions based on a strategic clarity absorbed throughout the campaign. They didn't need specific instructions because they understood the larger intent. The system wasn't rigid, it was organic, and that's exactly why it was so hard to break. Every lower-level commander knew not just what to do, but why they were doing it. The mission was clear, the method was free. This created an environment where tactical decisions could be made on the ground without waiting for top-down orders, yet still aligned with the central vision. This structure operated like a living organism, and that's what baffled enemies. Feudal armies, used to rigid, slow hierarchies, saw decentralization as weakness. Time and again, kingdoms underestimated Mongol strength, dismissing it as disorganized, savage, primitive. The mistake wasn't just tactical, it was epistemological. They failed to understand they were facing a doctrine where control wasn't imposed by direct coercion, but by clarity of purpose and a culture of command. The decimal system also had a psychological dimension. It dissolved tribal loyalties, replacing them with functional loyalty. A warrior didn't fight for a clan, but for his decimal unit. He was a soldier of the system, not just the nation. This shielded the structure from internal divisions and created large-scale cohesion. Genghis didn't just centralize political power, he reinvented what it meant to be part of an army. Discipline was enforced with extreme rigor. Deserters faced immediate death, and a group that allowed a member to flee was punished collectively. The effect was clear. Every man was responsible for the others. There was no room for individual weakness. The collective became unbreakable, not through faith in a charismatic leader, but through the awareness that survival depended on absolute synergy. This tactical self-management model is now studied in military academies and corporate leadership programs. Genghis's logic predates by centuries the modern concept of commander's intent, where a leader defines the mission's purpose but allows subordinates freedom of action. This idea, later formalized by modern armies like the German and Israeli forces, was already a living reality under Mongol command. There's also a symbolic aspect to this structure. It reflected the landscape that birthed it. The steppe doesn't forgive slowness. The distance between resources and constant vulnerability to attacks demanded perpetual adaptation. Genghis understood that an army should behave like a moving tribe, swift, cohesive, lethal. There was no time for messages between castles or formal rituals. There was only the time for decision and execution. This sense of urgency was embedded in the system and became its culture. Genghis's genius wasn't just in winning battles, but in creating a doctrine where individual errors were absorbed by collective intelligence, and where decision-making speed replaced the weight of tradition. His army seemed informal, but was mathematically organized. It appeared chaotic, but was governed by a discipline expressed in action, not in appearance. Ultimately, the true strength of the Mongol army wasn't its swift cavalry or its recurved bow. It was the invisible structure that allowed every soldier to act as part of a collective brain. A logic where one man's thought reverberated through 10,000 spears. That's why, against this living machine, empires fell not just from force, but from their inability to comprehend they were facing something they couldn't mimic or counter with their own paradigms. Kublai Khan wasn't born to be just a conqueror. From an early age, Genghis's grandson showed a rare trait among the steppe's sons, a fascination with foreign thought. While his brothers saw southern empires as mere territories to dominate, Kublai saw structures that could be adapted, redirected, absorbed. His vision of empire wasn't an extension of conquest, it was its transformation. When he launched his campaign against the Song dynasty, Kublai didn't just face larger, more numerous, and better-armed armies, he also confronted centuries of culture, bureaucracy, and political thought that made China an invisible fortress. But unlike previous invaders, he didn't try to erase this fortress, he used it as a foundation. Kublai's genius lay in understanding that integration was harder than conquest, and thus more valuable. Instead of imposing Mongol culture as dominant, he selectively adopted Chinese elements that could strengthen his authority without diluting his identity. Adopting Mandarin for official documents, appointing Confucian advisors, structuring taxes inspired by the Tang model, each choice was tactical. It wasn't surrender to the culture of the conquered, but an engineering of legitimacy. Kublai's court in Khanbalik, the future Beijing, was a complex theater. Mongol nobles mingled with Buddhist scholars, Persian mathematicians, and Chinese architects. It was a melting pot of influence under one logic. Anything that served stability, centralization, and dominance was welcome. Anything that reminded defeated enemies they were now integrated, not subjugated, was encouraged. But this integration didn't come at the cost of strength. Kublai maintained the Yasa Code as the backbone of discipline and ensured the Mongol military structure remained intact. In distant provinces, governors still reported to nomadic-blooded generals. Unification was real, but overseen. It was as if the empire donned southern robes, but kept the firm pulse of the steppe beneath the fabric. Historians still debate whether Kublai betrayed tradition or was its pinnacle. What few dispute is the impact of his approach. The Mongol Empire ceased to be a phenomenon of mobility and became a durable structure. He laid the foundations for the Yuan dynasty, the first foreign dynasty to rule all of China, and perhaps the only one that truly tried to reconcile the logic of conquest with the science of governance. China taught Kublai the value of permanence, and Kublai taught China the cost of absolute resistance. His legacy lies not just in military victories, but in a model of integration that defied the era's norms. Governing for him was an extension of war, and, like war, required understanding the terrain. In this case, the terrain was cultural, psychological, symbolic, and Kublai, as a strategist, read it like few others. In the balance between coercion and persuasion, Kublai leaned toward the latter without ever abandoning the former. This duality makes him unique. He didn't just invade a millennial empire, he made it work for him. In doing so, he not only extended Mongol dominance, but redefined what it meant to win a war, not ending with the destruction of the other, but with a controlled fusion of opposing worlds under one banner. Long before the Mongol Empire stretched from Korea to the Danube, its leaders understood that the true cement of power wasn't the number of soldiers or the quality of weapons, it was discipline. But not a bureaucratic discipline, like that of Roman legions or Chinese regiments. Mongol discipline was visceral, organic, rooted in fear and devotion. Its backbone had a name, Yasa. The Yasa Code, attributed to Genghis Khan, was more than a set of laws. It was an architecture of obedience, an invisible pact between the warrior and the ideal he represented. There was no room for ambiguity. Stealing, lying, disobeying a direct order, or abandoning a comrade in the field, all were punished with immediate death. But Yasa's impact went beyond punishment. It created an order where morality became military capital and fear became a form of cohesion. A Mongol warrior knew that failure endangered not just his life, but that of his entire unit. Collective responsibility turned each group into a single body, where one's weakness was countered by the vigilance of others. Personal honor gave way to the system's integrity. It wasn't a culture of lone heroes. It was a culture of operational silence, where every action reflected the greater ideal of absolute discipline. This obedience wasn't blind. It was almost religious. Genghis's generals didn't just demand orders be followed, they cultivated faith in the logic of command. Decisions were often accepted without debate, even at extreme risk, because the system had taught that survival was tied to the precision of the hierarchy. There was no time for discussion in the open field. Trust came from a reputation built in every campaign, from the consistency of punishments, from the clarity of rules. Yasa's effectiveness wasn't limited to combat. It permeated civilian life, trade, and relations with conquered peoples. Upon arriving in a city, the Mongols applied the code without exception, whether to allies or enemies, nobles or shepherds. This uniformity of justice, though harsh, created an unexpected form of respect. Conquered peoples often preferred the stability imposed by the Mongols to the chaos of local feudal lords. The documentary basis of Yasa is fragmented. It survives mostly in Arab and Persian accounts. But archaeology and diplomatic records suggest its power came less from written law and more from its application. It was a code manifested in actions, not inscriptions. Its effectiveness lay in the living memory of campaigns, in stories told around campfires, in examples of swift punishments, and in tales of victory attributed to inflexible order. In an era when empires crumbled from internal betrayal, succession disputes, or undisciplined armies, Yasa offered a stark contrast. It didn't make the Mongols invincible, but it made them cohesive. And in an age of fluid borders and unstable alliances, cohesion was a weapon in itself. Genghis understood that discipline, elevated to doctrine, could replace walls, offset numerical inferiority, and keep the empire unified across thousands of miles. The psychology of obedience, reinforced by fear, yes, but also by an internal logic of merit and clarity, is what made Yasa not just a tool of command, but a belief system. The Mongol warrior didn't fight only for territory. He fought because his identity was anchored in a code that defined who he was on and off the battlefield. And that identity, like the steel of his sword, was forged not in comfort, but in the conviction that order transforms ordinary men into cogs of an unstoppable machine.
In every burned village, in every city that surrendered without a fight, there was a meticulous logic, often invisible to contemporary chroniclers. For the Mongols, terror wasn't a byproduct of violence, it was a surgical tool designed with precision to disorganize, anticipate, and dominate. The fire wasn't just destruction, it was narrative. The plunder wasn't just looting, it was signaling. As Genghis Khan advanced on the borders of Transoxiana, he didn't aim only to conquer territories, he sought to break the symbolic link tying peoples to their cities, armies to their commanders, populations to the idea of resistance. The destruction of Nishapur or Merv, with tens of thousands dead, was calculated to echo beyond the walls, a wave of dread that preceded the army, eroding the will to fight before the first arrow was fired. Arab and Persian accounts describe a war where violence was preceded by rumors.
Merchants traveling ahead of the Mongol army spread tales of decimated cities, impaled governors, women and children taken as spoils. Many stories were true, others were carefully amplified. The enemy's psychology was shaped by doubt: resist and be annihilated, or surrender and retain some dignity. Controlled terror operated as an invisible but highly effective weapon. The side effect of this strategy was accelerated victories. When a city knew its neighbor had been reduced to ashes for resisting, surrender became the default. And when surrender came without a fight, the Mongols, in many cases, spared structures and even kept local authorities in administrative roles. But the system was binary. Immediate obedience brought stability. Resistance meant eradication. This brutal clarity created predictability, and with it, strategic efficiency. Archaeologists still find ash layers indicating massive fires in areas that resisted Mongol advances. In contrast, other cities show urban continuity and even prosperity under Mongol rule. This duality wasn't inconsistency, it was method. By keeping terror controlled, applying it selectively and symbolically, Genghis and his generals ensured wars were won with speed and disproportionate impact relative to physical effort. The use of rumors as a weapon also reveals the sophisticated nature of the psychological campaign. It wasn't enough to destroy physically, they needed to be remembered. The names of Mongol commanders had to be spoken with fear in Bedouin tents, among Volga merchants, in Buddhist monasteries or Venetian halls. Reputation preceded the attack, and often it was enough to open the gates. This logic approached the modern concept of information warfare. Perception manipulation was as critical as territorial occupation. Mongol military intelligence, with its network of spies and informants, directed which stories should circulate, on which routes, with which exaggerations. The image of an omnipresent, unpredictable, and relentless army was carefully cultivated. The doctrine of terror wasn't chaos, it was emotional engineering. The Mongols didn't need to convince the enemy of their technical superiority, they just needed to make resistance seem irrational. And when that conviction took hold, defenses crumbled, allies deserted, and walls became irrelevant. Contrary to simplistic views, Mongol terror wasn't sadism, it was extreme rationality. Violence was measured, strategic, applied with military precision. It was a language, a way of saying without words that the paradigms of war had changed, and those who didn't understand would vanish with their walls. In this new game, Genghis was less a bloodthirsty barbarian and more an architect of calculated fear, a mind that understood the silence of a defeated enemy before the battle even began was worth more than 1,000 noisy victories.
The dry steppe wind carried more than dust. It carried movement, direction, purpose. When the Mongol cavalry moved, it wasn't a march. It was an organism, a coordinated flow of speed and intent. No other medieval army so deeply grasped the relationship between time and space on the battlefield. For Genghis Khan, mobility wasn't an attribute, it was the center of gravity in war. The Mongol cavalry was almost entirely composed of mounted archers, trained from childhood to shoot with precision at full gallop. This allowed tactical freedom never seen before. While European and Chinese armies relied on heavy infantry, fixed lines, and frontal clashes, the Mongols operated like waves, attacking, retreating, diverting, reappearing. They didn't seek a front line, they created multiple flanks until the enemy's center collapsed entirely. Centuries before John Boyd formulated the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act. The Mongols instinctively executed it at full speed. Their information gathering was constant. Every skirmish was a probe, every retreat a psychological map of the enemy. They observed opponent behavior, reoriented their attack axes, decided autonomously,
and acted with precision. They did this repeatedly until the enemy was paralyzed, caught between expecting a frontal assault and facing a multi-pronged ambush. This agility wasn't limited to combat. It began with logistics. Each warrior carried multiple horses, switching mounts during long journeys. This enabled movements of up to 100 miles a day, an unthinkable speed for any land force of the era. Surprise wasn't accidental, it was engineered. Cities, believing they were safe for days, would see Mongol spears at dusk, as if the horizon had broken into a gallop. Chinese sources from the 13th century describe battles where imperial armies froze before Mongol mobility. The static logic of command couldn't keep up with shifting vectors. The enemy wasn't where it should be. Formations were always vulnerable. Walls built for prolonged sieges didn't stop lightning strikes or lateral infiltrations. The defenders' mental inertia was exploited ruthlessly. More than winning, the Mongols neutralized. It wasn't enough to destroy a formation. They needed to collapse the enemy's reaction logic. And that logic was swallowed by speed. The enemy commander's mind had to process what he saw while new units attacked from another angle. Response time vanished. Decision-making capacity was sabotaged not by force, but by the urgency imposed by mobility. This doctrine also had a symbolic component. Speed projected invincibility. For sedentary peoples accustomed to long, static wars, the idea that an army could cross mountains, deserts, and frozen rivers so quickly was demoralizing. War was no longer a predictable process. It was an avalanche. And that avalanche could come from any direction at any time. Archaeology confirms that Mongol routes crossed regions deemed impassable. Persian and Chinese documents show enemy generals often fought time, not troops. Battles were decided before the clash because Mongol mobility had reshaped the geometry of war. Terrain wasn't an obstacle, it was an ally. Distance didn't protect, it invited attack. Ultimately, what made the Mongol cavalry so devastating wasn't just the recurve bow or the number of horses. It was the mindset. War as movement, tactics as flow, victory as the collapse of the enemy's structure, not its mere destruction. And when that collapse came, it seemed causeless, only effect. As if the heavens had decided that empire should vanish, swallowed by dust and speed. Medieval generals, trained in codes of honor and predictable trenches, saw retreat as weakness. A fleeing army was a broken one. This deeply rooted belief in Western and Confucian mindsets became one of the deadliest traps the Mongols exploited. Genghis Khan understood that victory for the enemy was more dangerous than defeat, if misinterpreted. The strategic retreat was a favorite weapon. Executed with mastery, it involved simulating disorganization, deliberately opening a gap, and letting the enemy believe in their own superiority. When this happened, a predictable pattern emerged. Enemy commanders relaxed formations, rushed pursuits, or abandoned defensive positions. The result was catastrophic. Persian chronicles describe battles where entire Mongol units feigned panic, fleeing the field in haste only to lure the enemy into a valley, a narrow gorge, or a field rigged with hidden archers. The art of ambush lay in the confidence the enemy placed in the illusion. It required convincing performance, sweat, blood, screams, dropped gear. It meant building a theater of defeat, then turning the stage against those who entered it with arrogance. This technique was noted with astonishment by Muslim historians during the campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire. After a series of supposed defeats, the Mongols retreated, allowing local armies to occupy cities and fortresses. But the return was devastating. Divided, euphoric, and poorly positioned, defenders became easy prey for a force that had never truly fled, just shifted the angle of attack. The retreat wasn't improvised, it was textbook tactics. It required extreme discipline and precise communication. Each unit knew exactly when to retreat, in which direction, and where to reverse the move. It was a game of patience and precision, and it worked because it defied the emotional logic of the battlefield. Humans in combat cling to the idea that victory is visible, loud, obvious. The Mongols knew real victory was silent, ambushed, latent. This concept also applied strategically. Genghis never pushed a campaign past the point of diminishing returns. When terrain, climate, or local forces made a region temporarily inaccessible, he retreated. But this wasn't abandonment, it was postponement. The Mongols often withdrew for months, only to return when conditions shifted, with reinforcements, supplies, and superior terrain knowledge. The enemy, believing they'd repelled the invader, lowered their guard, and that's when collapse became inevitable. Strategic retreat shaped the perception of time. While adversaries fought to win the present moment, the Mongols operated in larger cycles. They understood that losing a battle wasn't the end, it was part of the sequence leading to final victory. This flexibility, this coldness toward their own retreat, was incomprehensible to commanders who saw each fight as a matter of honor. For Genghis, there was no greater honor than winning in the end, and that included retreating in the beginning. This logic required a rare kind of courage. Fleeing to win demands more control than charging to die. The men executing these maneuvers weren't cowards. They were soldiers who trusted their doctrine so deeply they accepted appearing defeated because they knew defeat was just a disguise. And when the disguise fell, the world fell with it. The art of strategic retreat isn't just a military technique, it's a philosophy of war, a way of understanding that combat isn't a straight line, but a dance between illusion and force, presence and absence. And the Mongols, more than dancers, were choreographers of this cruel stage. They knew when to exit the scene and, more importantly, they knew exactly when to return. Among the many mistakes empires made when facing the Mongols, perhaps the most dangerous was believing their strength depended solely on Genghis Khan. It was a shallow, almost childish reading that ignored the true structure sustaining the Mongol war machine. A layered command system, decentralized in execution, but absolutely cohesive in intent. Genghis didn't issue tactical orders to every front. He delegated missions with clear objectives, but left his generals free to decide how to achieve them. This required trust, and more than that, it required cultural preparation. From a young age, Mongol commanders were trained to think strategically, to grasp the larger campaign picture, and to interpret signals autonomously. They didn't wait for orders. They knew what to do, because they understood why. This model, now called commander's intent, predates by centuries the mission command practices adopted by modern armies, like the Germans in World War II, or the Israelis in 20th century conflicts. The premise is simple and powerful. The closer to the battlefield, the faster and more precise the decision must be. But this autonomy isn't chaos, it's intelligent coordination. In 13th century accounts, like those of Juvaini and Rashid al-Din, we see Mongol generals like Sube'etei and Jibei operating with total independence, conducting entire campaigns across foreign territories, facing extreme climates, hostile tribes, and critical logistical decisions, all without waiting for central instructions. This was possible only because there was a shared understanding. War had a larger purpose, and each commander was responsible for maintaining that strategic line, even when acting alone. The power of this system lay in its fluidity. When one front needed reinforcement, units were redistributed without compromising the whole. When an opportunity arose, it was seized on the spot. When a plan failed, there was no need to halt everything, just adapt. The Mongols didn't just tolerate local errors, they absorbed them, corrected them, and moved on. The layered structure wasn't designed to avoid mistakes, but to prevent them from contaminating the whole. This approach created an almost paradoxical effect. The larger the empire grew, the more agile it seemed. While enemies had to consult war councils, wait for messengers, or seek formal confirmations, Mongol generals were already acting. And when the enemy realized what was happening, the decision had already unfolded into movement, attack, and outcome. Administrative archaeology of conquered territories shows signs of this logic. Records of coordinated missions in distant regions indicate the command structure was not only military, but also civil. Local governors had leeway to handle tribes, taxes, and rebellions. Delegation was a principle, not an exception, and this made the empire resilient to distances, human failures, and even the loss of leaders. But there was a line that couldn't be crossed. Betraying the mission was betraying the system. Freedom came with absolute responsibility. When a commander failed due to personal ambition or deviated from the common goal, punishment was swift. The balance between freedom and obedience was maintained by the taut thread of trust built in campaigns, reinforced by the Yasa Code, and sustained by a culture of merit. Genghis understood something essential. Commanding wasn't controlling every detail. It was creating a network of converging decisions, where each point, even autonomously, followed the same direction. He didn't just build an army, he designed a collective mind, where every part thought, felt, and acted as an extension of the central purpose. This model made the Mongols unstoppable. It didn't matter if the center was far, if the messenger had died, or if the local situation had changed. The generals knew what to do, and they did it. Not out of blind obedience, but because the mission was rooted in every move. That's how Genghis commanded without being present. And that's how his empire, even far from the Khan's eyes, maintained the cohesion of a troop marching under a single banner.
At the heart of Mongol doctrine was a simple yet devastating conviction: the enemy should never understand the logic attacking them. While sedentary empires prided themselves on order, uniforms, and predictable parades, the Mongols turned unpredictability into doctrine. But this unpredictability wasn't improvisation. It was systematized, tested, refined. It was the science of asymmetric warfare in its purest form. Long before modern espionage, the Mongols operated with informal data collection networks. Merchants, travelers, and deserters were integrated as informants. Before an attack, target cities were studied, locations of wells, patrol schedules, internal conflicts. The army didn't arrive blind, it arrived as if it had lived in that territory for months. This allowed maneuvers to be executed with surgical precision, as if the battlefield had been drawn, not by geography, but by information. Unlike conventional warfare, where troop numbers and infantry strength were key, the Mongols used climate, timing, and perception as legitimate weapons. A notable example was the campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire, where advances were timed with river thaws and wind movements. Main forces attacked at dawn, with the sun at their backs, blinding enemy archers. Rain, fog, mud, these weren't obstacles, but strategic resources. This tactical use of the environment was complemented by simulation. Often the Mongols feigned a full advance to hide the real offensive from another flank. Other times they appeared disorganized to lure the enemy into error. The effect was always the same. The opponent never knew if they faced the main force or an illusory detachment, and when doubt set in, morale collapsed. The Mongols also used cultural calendars as attack elements. They launched campaigns on enemies' sacred dates, exploiting moments of distraction, festivities, or political reorganization. In Muslim-majority cities, for instance, they advanced during Ramadan, not out of religious disrespect, but logistical calculation. Attacking when the enemy is least prepared is more than an advantage, it's a disruption of the mental axis of resistance.
This asymmetric warfare wasn't disorganized, it was methodical. Letters sent to European kings made demands based on specific intelligence about fortresses, troops, and alliances. This showed not just surveillance, but interpreted surveillance. They didn't just know, they knew what to do with what they knew. Archaeology confirms this sophistication. In ruins of fortresses taken by the Mongols, artifacts of rudimentary espionage have been found. Coded messages, charcoal-drawn maps, reverse traps tailored to enemy defenses. These reveal an army that didn't just fight, it studied. Each campaign was a lesson, each battle an experiment. At the core of this logic was the idea that power lies not just in strength, but in ambiguity. When the enemy can't predict your action, they defend against ghosts. And against ghosts, the sharpest spear is useless. War becomes a shadow, a sensation, an unbearable anticipation. And when psychological pressure peaks, even the best armed fall, not to the blade, but to doubt. Genghis and his successors understood that asymmetry isn't inferiority, it's tactical freedom. It's operating outside the enemy's code, breaking patterns, rewriting rules. While others drew maps with borders and fortresses, the Mongols drew flows. Where there was rigidity, they sowed movement. Where there was certainty, they planted confusion. And thus, they became invincible, not by being stronger, but by being always unpredictable. Kublai Khan's strategic genius built bridges between worlds never before connected. He unified nomadic logic with imperial administration, linked steppe culture to Chinese writing, and embedded the Mongol Empire in the heart of Asian power. But there was a limit he couldn't cross, a limit not on maps, but in doctrine. And that limit was the sea. When planning invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281, Kublai imagined that the principles that conquered China and Central Asia could be replicated on the ocean. Speed, surprise, psychological terror. But the sea isn't the steppe, time doesn't bend the same way, and Japanese resistance didn't follow the Mongol script. The first expedition, with about 900 ships and over 30,000 men, was poorly coordinated from the start. Korean and Mongol troops clashed over logistics, language, and doctrine. Kyushu's beaches didn't offer the passive reception expected. Local samurai, highly trained in individual combat, put up fierce resistance. Kublai expected surrender. He got friction. And when a typhoon hit the anchored fleet, the campaign turned to disaster. About a third of the ships were destroyed. Determined, Kublai reorganized. In 1281, he launched a second, much larger offensive. Over 140,000 soldiers, 2,000 ships, divisions from China and the Korean peninsula. It was the largest fleet ever assembled at the time. But coordination between the two invasion arms failed. Forces didn't meet on schedule. While waiting, they faced constant Japanese attacks and another devastating typhoon. The destruction was total. This episode was later dubbed Kamikaze, the divine wind that saved Japan. But what really destroyed the campaign wasn't the wind. It was trying to apply land logic to naval warfare. Kublai's error wasn't strategic in the classical sense. The motivation made sense: securing supremacy in East Asia and neutralizing future Japanese threats. But it was doctrinal. He underestimated the difference between an environment where mobility could be controlled and one where natural, cultural, and geographic forces operated autonomously. The Mongol cavalry, the engine of land campaigns, was ineffective on mountainous forested islands. Naval command communication was slow, logistics risky, morale vulnerable. Later Chinese documents note the hesitation of Kublai's officers to pursue large-scale naval campaigns. The Mongol fleet wasn't rebuilt with the same vigor. It was understood that the sea required a different mindset, a war where time and climate decided more than formation or intent, a war where the enemy couldn't always be predicted and territorial control didn't guarantee route dominance. This failure is paradoxically one of Kublai's greatest lessons. It shows that even tactical genius has limits imposed by the nature of the terrain, that doctrine, no matter how flexible, must adapt to each combat ecosystem, that the same system that subjugates continents can disintegrate before the current. Trying to transpose steppe logic to the sea is a reminder that true strategists don't replicate formulas. They know when to abandon them. Kublai's error doesn't diminish him. It humanizes him. It shows that even an empire built on adaptation can fall victim to its own confidence. In the end, the sea revealed what no land army could, a limit to the Mongol Empire. Not because it was stronger, but because it spoke a different language. And when you don't speak the battlefield's language, even the greatest generals can't translate their victories into real dominance. In war, time isn't just a variable. It's the substance of victory or ruin. And among all the weapons forged by the Mongol Empire, perhaps none was as subtle, as devastating, and as misunderstood as speed. Not just the speed of galloping horses, tactical movement, or territorial crossings, but the speed of decision, presence, and reaction. The speed that breaks not walls, but certainties. Fortified cities across the Islamic world and northern China learned the hard way that they knew of the Mongol advance, but not in time. News of Bukhara, Samarkand, or Si Shah's fall spread before the ashes cooled, and with it a paralyzing sensation, being next. Psychological time was eroded long before the battle. Armies stood ready, walls reinforced, supplies stocked. But there were no answers, because the enemy didn't give time to think. 13th century sources like Juvayni and William de Rubruck recount cities receiving reports of distant attacks and, days later, seeing the Mongol vanguard on the horizon. Speed disconnected normal cycles of preparation and defense. The enemy seemed to cross mountains in silence, deserts in hours, rivers in minutes, and with that, the line between fact and rumor dissolved. It was impossible to tell where the Mongols truly were because they seemed to be everywhere at once. This multiplication of presence generated terror even without combat. The mere rumor of an attack sparked desertions at outposts, hasty negotiations, and internal sabotage. Collapse came not from direct impact, but from the perception of inevitability. How do you fight an army that doesn't wait, doesn't hesitate, doesn't explain? How do you keep morale high when even good news arrives too late? The psychological impact of Mongol speed was so potent that many accounts describe enemy generals making catastrophic errors, leaving fortifications to face what they thought was a smaller force, abandoning defensive positions at the slightest sign of retreat, or surrendering entire cities without firing a shot. The mind collapsed before the walls. The city was defeated before the siege. Archaeology confirms this preempted panic. In many sites of Mongol attacks, there are no clear signs of prolonged resistance. There are traces of mass flight, internal fires caused by residents, gates opened in confusion. The city stopped functioning before the army arrived. Speed had done the work. This phenomenon can be described as temporal superiority. It wasn't just about arriving fast, but forcing the enemy to live in delay. While the Mongols decided in the present, their opponents reacted to the past. When a response was formulated, it was already irrelevant. The next city had fallen. The next column had moved. This doctrine required absolute mastery of logistics, terrain reading, and unit coordination. But above all, it demanded an understanding that war isn't a static map. It's a flow. And when you master the flow, you master morale. War becomes a race against perception itself. Genghis Khan understood that an enemy's collapse doesn't need to be physical. It can be mental, narrative, symbolic. And for that, speed is the tip of the spear. A city that fears tomorrow more than today's fight is already defeated. A general who doesn't know where the enemy is has already lost control. An empire reliant on slow messengers already lives in the past, and in that past, the Mongols have already won. In most military civilizations, the commander is the visible epicenter. He leads from the front, raises the sword, inspires through action. His presence on the battlefield is not just tactical, but symbolic. Genghis Khan chose a different path. He turned his absence into presence. His anonymity in critical battle moments was paradoxically what most reinforced his authority. Because instead of leading with his voice, he led with his system. And in that system, every general acted as if Genghis were there, even when he wasn't. This choice wasn't modesty or cowardice, it was psychological calculation. By not centering glory on himself, Genghis allowed his commanders to earn real prestige based on merit and results. A victorious Mongol general wasn't an order executor. He was a tactical architect within a larger plan. The victory was his, but also the empire's. This decentralization of recognition built a rare collective spirit. You didn't fight for a man, but for a system that worked. And that functionality became faith. Genghis's absence in many battles created constant doubt in enemies. Who's in command? Where's the Khan? Is he behind us? Already among us? This uncertainty amplified terror. Unlike Western armies, which relied on the leader's constant image at the center, the Mongols operated as a network. Every point was command, every action an extension of the central mind. Omnipresence was built through multiplied logic, not repeated imagery. Persian sources describe battles where Genghis never set foot in the theater of operations. Sube'etei and Jebei, his most renowned generals, led entire campaigns from the Caucasus to Hungary with full authority. Their decisions shaped the known world, but in every letter sent, every proclamation they made clear, in the name of Genghis Khan. Authority flowed from an invisible but unquestionable source. This calculated absence had profound effects within the ranks. It eliminated the cult of personality. No soldier believed victory depended on the Khan's gaze or sword. Victory came from the system the Khan created. This bred resilience. Even with Genghis distant or dead, the empire functioned. Campaigns continued. The machine kept turning. Military archaeologists and modern historians note that the Mongol command model created a lasting operational culture. Regions conquered by Genghis continued applying his military doctrines decades after his death. This is only possible when the structure outlives the founder, when the system isn't a mirror of the leader, but a projection of his principles. Perception manipulation extended to propaganda. When a city resisted and was defeated, Genghis's orders often spared local leaders who showed courage and intelligence. This created an image of selective justice, harsh but rational. The message was clear: surrender and be integrated. Resist senselessly and be erased. The commander's physical absence was offset by the presence of consistent policy. Genghis didn't want to be worshipped. He wanted to be remembered as inevitable. His shadow was more powerful than his figure, and that shadow loomed over the battlefield even when he was thousands of miles away planning the next move. That's the essence of the invisible commander, not leading through visibility but through internalized logic, turning every soldier into an extension of the plan, making absence not weakness but strength. An empire where perception is a weapon, and true power lies not in the one shouting orders, but in the one who has already shaped the silence.
The fall of the Mongol Empire didn't erase its influence. On the contrary, like invisible tracks beneath history's dust, its doctrines continued to echo, not just in the Central Asian steppes, but in command rooms, war manuals, and military academies. Yet most modern generals still fail to grasp the essence of the model Genghis and Kublai Khan left to the world.
Because this model isn't about victory alone, it's a logic of command, a mental map for thinking war beyond weapons. The most common mistake is reducing the Mongols to speed, terror, or brutality. These existed, but they were effects, not causes. The core of Mongol strategy was adaptability, the ability to operate in unknown territories, adjust doctrines in real time, and turn limitations into tactical advantages. Mobility, decentralization, fear, and perception manipulation were just tools of this greater matrix. The modern world, with all its sensors, satellites, and AI, still stumbles on the same flaw that doomed medieval empires: mental rigidity. The belief that more technology means more control. Genghis proved the opposite. His empire was analog, but his thinking was digital, fragmented, fast, interconnected. He didn't seek predictability, he sought flow. And flow isn't commanded with spreadsheets, but with vision. CEOs, generals, and political leaders today still operate with pyramidal models. They centralize decisions, believing authority is imposed top-down. The Mongol Empire taught the opposite. Authority is distributed with responsibility. Command is sustained by purpose, not coercion. And a leader who doesn't teach subordinates to think becomes a hostage to their own centralization. Mongol operational decentralization anticipated concepts like mission command, autonomous cells, and networked response. In a world where war is increasingly asymmetric, where threats come not in columns but in clusters, this model should be studied more deeply, not as an exotic curiosity, but as a functional standard. Kublai Khan's doctrinal flexibility, adopting Chinese structures without losing nomadic essence, shows that integration isn't submission, it's strategy. You can absorb the best of others while keeping your tactical identity. This is a critical lesson for a 21st century marked by fragile alliances, hybrid conflicts, and cultural clashes. Modern warfare still suffers from the illusion that winning is destroying. The Mongols knew that winning is assimilating. True dominance isn't in the flag raised, but in the logic absorbed. They didn't just conquer territories, they converted systems, shaped behaviors, redrew mental borders. A Mongol general didn't want just the castle, he wanted the code of conduct of its inhabitants. Contemporary command schools value precision, control, standardization. The Mongols operated with ambiguity, decentralization, fluidity. This didn't make them less professional, it made them more effective, because they knew the real war isn't the one planned, it's the one survived. And surviving, ultimately, is deciding better under friction, uncertainty, and chaos. The Khan's legacy is still on the table, waiting to be rediscovered. And perhaps the most urgent question isn't what we can learn from them, but why we haven't learned yet. Because while we seek innovation in labs, they built it on horseback, through forests and deserts, and they created not just an empire, but a code of thought, a model of command, a way of seeing conflict and winning it, while others are still trying to understand what's happening. The story of the Khans, told through their campaigns, decisions, and systems, is often read through the lens of epic grandeur. But true genius lies not in the shine of conquests, it's in navigating friction, that silent force acting between plan and battlefield, order and action. Genghis and Kublai Khan didn't win because they had the best armies. They won because they understood war as a language, a sequence of codes and symbols that once deciphered could be rewritten. Both shaped their contexts with the clarity of those who don't believe in formulas. Genghis turned a fragmented people into an adaptive command network, capable of thinking as one body while operating in multiple directions. Kublai, heir to this matrix, expanded the empire with the sophistication of those who know governing is harder than destroying. And only those who understand the difference between domination and assimilation can govern. This deep understanding of war as a language made them unbeatable for decades. not because they were superhuman, but because they rejected rigidity. They embraced combat as variables, friction as inevitable, errors as part of the process, not moral failures. In this terrain of uncertainty, they didn't just survive, they dominated. Genghis didn't lead by myth, but by method. Kublai didn't govern by imposition, but by a fine reading of the social fabric. Together, they proved war is more than force, it's decision. And decision, when rooted in real knowledge, creates an invisible architecture where command doesn't need to shout, it just needs to exist. B.H. Littlehart's words stand as a tactical epitaph for this journey. The indirect strategy is the true art of sustainable victory. That's what the Khans executed. Victory without insistence, dominance without exhaustion, control without constant presence. The invisible acting on the visible, a plan that bends to reality and turns it into advantage. In the end, the question isn't just historical, it's personal. Do you lead like a king or like a Khan? Comment: which of the Khan's tactics, principles, or visions impacted you most and why? Your response isn't just an opinion exercise, it's a command exercise. Because every decision, before action, is reading, and every deep reading is, at its core, an act of strategic warfare.